twin suns burned low over the horizon, their light spilling molten gold across the alien desert and igniting the dust storms that prowled the horizon in restless spirals. The air shimmered with heat, carrying the scent of scorched minerals, and the hum of distant engines echoed faintly through the canyon walls. Captain Elias Ward felt the weight of the moment pressing on him as firmly as the sand under his boots. Humanity's expeditionary fleet had been tasked with finding allies among the stars, but the mission was more than diplomacy. It was survival. Their reach had outstripped their resources, and without allies, Earth's people risked extinction on the galactic stage. The Drukhari had not been chosen lightly. Ancient, enigmatic, and powerful beyond human comprehension, they were a race both feared and revered across the stars. Yet it was not their fleet nor their armies that Elias faced now. It was their princess. She stood a few paces away, framed by the burning sky, a figure out of half-remembered legends. Her skin was a flawless azure, as if carved from living stone. Her golden eyes glowed with a molten intensity, catching every flicker of light as though they contained fragments of dying suns. Braided hair, pale as ivory, flowed over her shoulders and down her back, interwoven with delicate bands of gold. A crown of intricate filigree rested upon her brow, its gems pulsing faintly within a fire. The armor she wore gleamed with artistry no human forge could replicate, its surfaces etched with shifting patterns that seemed alive, rippling faintly in rhythm with her breath. Every inch of her radiated authority, as if the desert itself had chosen her as its sovereign. Elias had dealt with warlords, bureaucrats, and politicians, but Princess Vera was unlike any of them. She exuded command effortlessly, and her silence carried more weight than speeches. He had prepared for days, memorizing rituals, learning fragments of the Drukhari tongue, and reminding himself endlessly to tread carefully. Humanity's reputation preceded them. They were viewed as brash upstarts, reckless and loud, stumbling through the galaxy with fire in their hands. One mistake could end negotiations before they began. The silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of the wind curling through the rocks. Vera's gaze lingered on Elias, unblinking, as though peeling back the layers of his intent. He steadied his breathing, reminded himself that he was here as humanity's envoy, not its conqueror. He had to convince her that humans were more than desperate scavengers clawing for survival. He had to make her believe in cooperation. He spoke slowly, with careful restraint. "Your Highness, humanity comes with respect. We know the galaxy does not forgive weakness. We do not ask for your protection, only a chance to prove our worth." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest curl of disdain tugging at her lips. She said nothing, but her silence weighed heavier than any rebuttal. Elias felt the gaze of a retinue on him, Drukhari guards in burnished armor, their faces concealed by visors shaped like snarling beasts. Their weapons glowed faintly, ready to discharge if ordered. Behind him, a handful of his own crew waited tensely, their hands resting on sidearms, though Elias had ordered restraint. Every man and woman present understood that a single misstep might unleash bloodshed. He felt the tension like a rope pulled taut, and in that moment of intensity, instinct betrayed him. Seeking to emphasize sincerity, he reached out and touched her wrist lightly, a human gesture meant to bridge distance, a physical anchor for his words. The reaction was instantaneous. Her eyes blazed, a storm of gold fire igniting within them. She pulled back as though his touch carried venom, her expression sharpening into something cold and deadly. She raised a hand, palm outward, and a surge of shimmering light erupted in the air between them. The sparks danced like fragments of stars, swirling into constellations before collapsing into a dangerous shimmer, ready to strike. The canyon fell utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to recoil. Her voice, when it came, was smooth as tempered steel, carrying the weight of centuries. "Touch me again, human, and you will pay the price." Elias's throat tightened. He realized, too late, that his well-meaning gesture had been sacrilege. In Drukhari culture, he now remembered, touch was not casual. It was sacred, reserved for blood bonds and oaths older than memory. His mistake had not been a stumble in etiquette, it had been an insult of the highest order. The gods shifted, their weapons humming with restrained energy. One word from their princess would ignite a massacre. His crew bristled, fingers twitching near weapons they were forbidden to draw. Elias saw the sweat bead on their brows, the silent questions in their eyes. Would diplomacy end in fire? He forced himself to hold her gaze, resisting the urge to bow, to plead, to retreat. Any weakness would confirm what she already suspected, that humanity was unworthy, a child race stumbling among giants. He straightened his back, inhaled against the dry air, and spoke with quiet conviction. I meant no offense, princess. Among my people, touch conveys sincerity. It was clumsy, and I accept your warning. But know this, humanity does not come to kneel. We come to stand as equals, if you will allow it. For a long, breathless moment, she did not lower her hand. The sparks coiled tighter, a galaxy compressed into her palm, humming with latent destruction. Her gaze searched him, weighing his soul as though she might see the truth of humanity written in his marrow. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, her hand fell. The light collapsed into embers, drifting upward and vanishing into the twilight. The gods relaxed fractionally, though their weapons remained close. The tension did not break, but it loosened, enough for Elias to breathe again. Vera tilted her head, studying him with a curiosity that was colder than any blade. She had not forgiven him, nor accepted his explanation. But she had spared him, and in sparing him, she had offered something more dangerous than rejection, a test. Elias understood it then. This was not about words, nor gestures. Humanity would not be judged by speeches but by deeds. If he failed, it would not be his failure alone, it would be Earth's. The desert wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of ozone and the promise of a storm. The negotiation had begun, but not in the way he had imagined. What lay ahead was no longer a matter of diplomacy. It was a trial, and the outcome would decide whether humanity's voice would be heard in the chorus of the galaxy, or silenced forever. And as the last light of the suns dipped below the horizon, Elias knew that the princess's warning still hung in the air, more binding than any treaty. Touch me again, human, and you'll pay the price. The desert fortress loomed like a crown of stone upon the horizon, its towers carved from jagged cliffs, glowing faintly with veins of mineral that pulsed like the heartbeat of the world itself. As Elias followed the Drakari escort through its gates, he felt the weight of countless eyes on him, warriors, priests, and nobles, each studying the alien intruder with suspicion sharpened to a blade's edge. Princess Vera walked ahead, her posture flawless, her steps measured, and though her face remained composed, Elias sensed that every motion was deliberate. She wanted him to feel the gulf between them, to know he walked not as an equal, but as one tolerated only because she allowed it. Inside, the fortress breathed with ritual. Braziers burned with pale blue flame that emitted no smoke. Incense curled upward like whispering spirits. The walls bore carvings of celestial wars, constellations locked in eternal combat, with the Drakari always triumphant. Their mythology was not hidden, it was architecture, surrounding him at every turn. Elias's mind catalogued every detail, because he knew these people would not explain their culture. Understanding them was his burden, and misunderstanding them could mean his death. When they reached the central hall, the princess ascended a dais of polished obsidian and turned to face him. The silence stretched once more, and though Elias had learned patience in countless negotiations, the pressure here was unlike anything he had faced before. He stood in the midst of a 1,000-year-old ritual space, surrounded by beings who doubted his right even to breathe the same air. His instinct told him that words alone would never sway them. He would have to endure, to prove through action what speeches could not accomplish. Vera's voice, cool and resonant, finally broke the silence. You speak of respect, human, yet your hands betray ignorance. The Drakari do not measure worth by promises. We measure it by endurance. If you would prove that humanity deserves to stand among the stars, you will do so by trial, not by tongue. A ripple passed through the hall, half approval, half challenge. Elias's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head. Then tell me your terms. She raised one hand, and the chamber dimmed as if the light itself bowed to her command. 3 trials. Endure them, and your people may yet earn a hearing. Fail, and your fleet will leave this world in silence, never to return. The first trial began that very night. He was led into the open desert, stripped of shielding and technology, and left beneath the unrelenting twin suns. The heat pressed against him like an iron forge, searing every breath, until even his bones felt scorched. He wrapped himself in the lessons of survival drilled into him from years of training, rationing water, conserving energy, digging shallow trenches to shield from the wind. Yet what sustained him most was the knowledge that his crew, his people, would carry the stain of his failure if he faltered. By dawn, when Drukhari warriors came to retrieve him, he stood upright, skin blistered, lips cracked, but unbowed. The second trial tested not his body, but his will. Blindfolded and led along a sacred path that wound through cliffs and across narrow ridges, he was ordered to walk without sight, guided only by instinct. Whispers filled the air, illusions woven by Drukhari priests, designed to unmake the mind. Voices called to him, the sound of his sister who had died years ago, the laughter of comrades long buried, even the echoes of Earth itself, tempting him to abandon the path. His heart ached, but he forced his steps onward, refusing to believe shadows. When the blindfold was finally removed, he stood before the princess once more, the path complete. Sweat clung to him, but his eyes held clarity. The third trial came within the fortress walls. He was led to a chamber lit only by starlight funneled through crystal windows. There, the priests conjured illusions of battle, forcing him to relive the bloodiest moments of humanity's wars. He saw his soldiers die again and again, his failures magnified, every weakness exposed. His instinct screamed to fight back, to rage against the illusions, but he understood the test was not of victory, it was of endurance. He bore the visions, forcing himself to remember that humanity's story was not defined by defeat, but by survival despite it. When the illusions faded, he remained kneeling, breath ragged, but alive in spirit. When the trials ended, Elias was brought once more before Princess Vera. Her golden gaze swept over him, searching for cracks in his resolve, expecting perhaps to find only a broken man. Instead, she saw someone who had endured each ordeal with a stubborn fire that mirrored her own people's pride. For the first time, her expression softened, not warmth, not approval, but recognition. "You endure," she said simply. "It is unexpected." He straightened, though his muscles ached and his throat burned from days of trial. "Respect is not won in a single moment, princess. Nor is trust. But I did not come here to be coddled or dismissed. I came to prove that humanity will not kneel and vanish quietly into the void. We will fight, we will adapt, and we will survive. That is what we are." For a fleeting instant, something flickered in her gaze, curiosity, perhaps even the faintest ember of respect. Yet as quickly as it came, it was masked again beneath her regal composure. She turned away, her voice colder once more. "Your trials are not complete, Captain. The galaxy itself will test you, and its judgment is harsher than mine." Elias caught the meaning beneath her words. She had seen enough to keep humanity at the table, but her doubts lingered, and the greater challenge was yet to come. The trials had not been the end, they had only been the beginning. As the fortress resettled into silence and the torches dimmed, Elias understood that the princess had given him something rarer than approval. She had given him the chance to stand in the shadow of her judgment a little longer. And though her warning still lingered in his mind, "Touch me again, and you'll pay the price," he also knew she had not turned her back on him. Somewhere in the storm of her doubt, a door had cracked open. Whether humanity would step through it, or be cast forever into darkness, was a question only the coming days would answer. The warning came with the sunrise. A distant tremor rippled through the sand, subtle at first, then rising into a low thunder that rattled the stones of the fortress. Elias stood upon the battlements, his skin still healing from the burns of the desert trial, and watched the horizon with narrowing eyes. The sky bled with unnatural light, streaks of violet fire scarring the pale heavens. Ships moved there, dark silhouettes against the suns, advancing in formation too disciplined to be traders or pilgrims. The Drukhari guard stiffened, their armor humming as their weapons came alive. The rival empire had arrived, and they came not to parley. Princess Vera emerged onto the wall, her presence commanding even in the shadow of war. Her armor shimmered with a faint glow, threads of starlight curling from her pauldrons as if the cosmos itself bent to her. She said nothing at first, only studied the enemy approach with eyes that burned brighter than the dawn. Elias watched her, trying to read the thoughts hidden behind her expression. There was no fear there, only calculation, and perhaps the faintest flicker of disdain for the threat that loomed across the sky. "They seek to test our dominion," she said at last, her voice even. "They believe us weakened. They are wrong." Her words carried like iron, steadying the Drakari soldiers who had begun to whisper among themselves. Yet Elias heard more than pride in her tone. He heard the weight of expectation. To the Drakari, defeat was unthinkable. Victory was not merely desired, it was demanded by blood and history. The fortress was a symbol, and if it fell, it would not just be stone that crumbled. It would be their very claim to greatness. The first barrage came before the suns had fully risen. Plasma fire screamed through the sky, striking the desert floor with explosions that turned sand into sheets of glass. The fortress trembled under the impact, dust falling like ash from the carved ceilings. Elias's instincts surged into motion. He had fought wars on Earth, skirmishes where survival depended not on pride but on cleverness, improvisation, and a refusal to die quietly. The Drakari prepared to answer the assault with ritual formations, their soldiers aligning with ceremonial precision. To Elias's eye, it was beautiful but flawed. They left themselves exposed, predictable in their movements. "Your enemy already knows this dance," Elias said sharply, turning to Vera. "They've studied you. If you fight as you always have, they will break you." Golden eyes cut toward him, sharp as a blade. For a heartbeat he thought she would dismiss him outright, but instead she tilted her head, measuring him once again as she had in the desert. "And what would you suggest, human?" That was scatter like frightened prey. "No," Elias replied, voice firm. "That you fight like survivors. Unpredictable. Ruthless. Human." The words hung between them, charged with defiance. Around them, Drakari soldiers shifted uneasily at the suggestion that a human might guide their strategy. But Vera did not silence him. Instead, she gave the faintest nod, a gesture small enough to be deniable, yet unmistakable in its meaning. The battle descended into chaos. Enemy ships unleashed waves of fire, but Elias directed small squads into the canyons, turning the terrain into a weapon. Drakari warriors, disciplined and fierce, adapted under his orders, launching ambushes where tradition would have demanded open confrontation. Vera herself moved through the fray like a living storm. She summoned constellations with a sweep of her hand, threads of light weaving into spears that shattered enemy machines. To fight alongside her was to witness a force of nature, terrible and awe-inspiring. Elias found himself caught between wonder and pragmatism. Where she summoned power from the stars, he countered with grit and instinct, setting traps, rallying soldiers, and using every scrap of knowledge he had learned from Maut's desperate wars. The contrast between them was stark, her elegance and grandeur, his raw and improvised defiance, but together their strengths meshed into something greater than either could wield alone. Midway through the battle, a blast struck close to the fortress wall. The ground split, hurling Elias from his feet. He scrambled to rise, the world ringing in his ears, and saw Vera standing at the edge of the fracture, her aura faltering. Blood streaked her temple, though she ignored it, her focus fixed on the enemy pressing closer. She raised her hand to conjure another constellation, but her fingers trembled, the light sputtering. Before he could think, Elias moved. He caught her as she staggered, his arm bracing her weight. For a single suspended moment, everything stilled, the battle, the fire, even the breath in his lungs. He had touched her again. Her head turned slowly, golden eyes locking onto his. He braced for the storm, for fire and fury, for the wrath she had promised him before. Yet none came. Instead, her gaze lingered, searching him in silence. She saw no insult this time, no arrogance. She saw the simple truth. He had reached for her not in ignorance, but to keep her standing when the world sought to tear her down. The bond forged in that instant was fragile, unspoken, but undeniable. She did not pull away. She allowed his touch, and by allowing it, she permitted more than contact, she permitted trust. Then, with renewed strength, she tore free from his grasp and unleashed a torrent of light that obliterated the enemy line, the desert itself trembling under the force. The battle raged until the sun dipped low, painting the horizon red with fire and smoke. At last, the enemy retreated, their ships breaking formation and scattering into the void. The fortress still stood, Scarred but unbroken, its defenders weary yet alive. Cheers erupted among the Drukhari, their voices rising in triumph, but Elias knew the victory was incomplete. This was not the end, only the prelude. As silence settled over the battlefield, Vera turned to him once more. Her face was unreadable, regal mask firmly in place, but her words carried a weight different than before. You fight as if you were born for storms. You endure where others would fall. Perhaps humanity is not as fragile as I believed. Elias met her gaze, exhausted but unyielding. We don't survive because we're strong, princess. We survive because we refuse not to. For the first time, she did not challenge his words. She only studied him, her silence no longer dismissive but contemplative, as though she had begun to see humanity through a lens not of insult or trial, but of possibility. The desert wind carried the scent of smoke and starlight. Though the enemy had fled, Elias felt the shadow of greater wars looming. He knew the princess's judgment was not yet sealed, that her trust was still an ember waiting for breath. But he also knew something had shifted irreversibly. He had touched her hand in the heart of battle, and instead of death, it had sparked a fragile, dangerous alliance. The fortress had scarcely finished smoldering when the sky split open again. This time the rival fleet did not test the Drukhari defenses with scattered strikes. It descended in full force, their warships blotting out the twin suns. Elias stood beside Princess Vera at the highest tower, watching the enemy formation gather like storm clouds heavy with lightning. The air trembled under the weight of engines, and the desert stretched endless below them, waiting to be scarred once more. He felt the fatigue in his body, the ache of burned skin and battered muscles, but there was no space for weakness. Humanity's fate, perhaps more than its survival, hung in the balance of this single day. Vera's expression was a mask of iron. She lifted her chin, the wind catching her ivory braids and scattering them like banners, her eyes molten with starlight. Yet beneath the regal bearing, Elias saw the shadow of calculation. She knew the fortress could not withstand another siege without change. The old ways, the rituals and perfected strategies, would crumble beneath sheer force. For the first time since their meeting, her silence carried not disdain but a question unspoken. What now? They'll throw everything at us, Elias said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. If we hold the walls, they'll grind us down. We need to strike where they don't expect it. Her gaze turned to him, sharp and piercing. You would have us abandon our bastion, risk the shame of retreat. He shook his head. Not retreat. Strike. Take the fight to them, before they can smother us. Surprise is all we have left. For a moment she studied him, her lips pressed into a line, then the faintest curve lifted the corner of her mouth. Not approval, not yet, but recognition of courage. She gave the order, her voice resonating through the halls of the fortress, summoning warriors to prepare not for defense, but for the storm that lay ahead. The battle ignited with a fury unmatched by the previous day. The desert sky became a canvas of fire, streaked with burning trails of plasma and shattering constellations of light. Drukhari war chants thundered through the canyons, matched by the guttural roar of enemy ships pressing forward. Elias led small strike teams through the dunes, weaving ambushes with precision, each move a blend of human ingenuity and Drukhari discipline. Where Vera's soldiers had once fought like dancers bound by ritual, they now moved with unpredictability, guided by his relentless instincts. At the center of it all stood the princess herself, radiant and terrible. She called down fragments of the night sky, weaving them into blades that tore through enemy armor. Her body glowed with celestial fire, her every motion both graceful and lethal. To stand near her was to feel the heat of a star-made flesh, and Elias could not help but marvel even as he fought to survive. Yet he also saw the toll it exacted. Her power was not endless, and each surge left her breath shorter, her shoulders heavier. The enemy pressed closer, overwhelming even the combined strength of human and Drukhari resistance. Explosions ripped through the outer walls of the fortress, sending shards of stone raining into the dust. Soldiers faltered, lines wavered, and for a fleeting moment it seemed the tide would break them entirely. Vera staggered, her glow faltering as blood streaked across her armor. She raised her hand to summon light once more, but the constellations shattered before they formed, her strength spent. Elias saw it all in an instant, the enemy charging through the breach, her power fading, the soldiers around them ready to collapse. Instinct surged, the same instinct that had once betrayed him with a touch. Without hesitation, he seized a hand, gripping it firmly though he knew what taboo he shattered. Gasps tore from the Drukhari soldiers who witnessed it. Some turned in outrage, weapons half-raised, ready to execute him where he stood. But before any blow could fall, the world itself seemed to change. Vera's golden eyes widened, not with fury but with shock, and then a blaze of power erupted between them. His hand burned with starlight, his veins filled with fire that was not his own. Her energy coursed into him, not consuming but merging, fusing human resilience with Drukhari brilliance. Together, they unleashed a storm. Light erupted from their joined hands, a torrent of brilliance that poured across the battlefield. The enemy ships staggered as constellations were dragged from the heavens and hurled downward, exploding with celestial force. Where Vera's magic had once been majestic but limited, the fusion with Elias's stubborn endurance made it unbreakable. The desert floor split and the sky screamed with brilliance until the enemy formation shattered, retreating in chaos before the onslaught. When silence returned, the fortress still stood. The battlefield lay scarred, littered with the remnants of enemy war machines, glowing faintly in the settling dust. Drukhari soldiers dropped to their knees, not in despair but in awe, their eyes fixed upon their princess and the human who had stood at her side. The taboo had been broken, and yet in breaking it, something greater had been forged. Vera turned to Elias, their hands still linked, her gaze unreadable. Slowly, deliberately, she released him, her composure returning though her breath was still uneven. She faced her people, raising her voice to carry across the silence. This human has touched what no other has. Not in insult, not in arrogance, but in honor. He stood when others would fall. Let it be known, humanity is not to be dismissed. They are allies worthy of respect. The proclamation rolled like thunder through the fortress. Some stared in disbelief, others with awe, but none dared oppose her. Elias felt the weight of what had just unfolded settle into him like a brand. He had not only earned her recognition, he had altered the course of his species' place in the galaxy. When the crowd dispersed, Vera lingered beside him, her gaze softer than before. "You risked much, touching me again," she said quietly. "I didn't think," Elias admitted. "I only knew you couldn't fall." For the first time, her lips curved into something that almost resembled a smile. "Then perhaps the price I promised has already been paid." As the twin suns dipped toward the horizon and the desert wind carried away the smoke of battle, Elias understood that the war was far from over. More enemies would come, and the galaxy would test humanity in ways he could not yet imagine. But he also knew this: the bond forged in fire and starlight was real, and it would carry them into whatever storms awaited. The days after the battle unfolded in an uneasy rhythm, as though the fortress itself held its breath. The Drukhari soldiers moved with renewed vigor, but beneath their disciplined efficiency lingered whispers that refused to die. A human had touched the princess, not once but twice, and lived. Twice, or better, depending on who spoke of it, that touch had turned the tide of war. The story spread like wildfire, reshaping the rigid lines of tradition that had once seemed immutable. Elias felt the weight of those stares wherever he walked, some filled with awe, others with resentment, all carrying the knowledge that he had crossed a line no outsider was meant to even approach. Vera carried herself with her usual command, but Elias noticed the subtle changes. She no longer kept her distance from him, no longer treated his presence as an irritant she had to endure. When she passed him orders, her tone still cut with sharp precision, yet now there was an undercurrent of consideration, as though she weighed not just his obedience but his perspective. The alliance between them had not been spoken aloud, but it existed nonetheless, a bond woven in fire and necessity. Still, Elias could sense the turbulence beneath her calm, the struggle between centuries of doctrine and the undeniable truth of what they had done together. The central conflict lay not with the enemy fleets, at least not yet, but within the walls of the fortress itself. Drukhari nobles arrived in the days following, summoned by urgency and pride. Clad in shimmering robes threaded with starlight and iron, they filled the council chambers with their voices, demanding answers, demanding tradition be upheld, demanding punishment for the human who had broken sacred boundaries. Elias stood in the shadow of that gathering, watching his alien eyes turned upon him like blades. Vera faced them with unwavering poise. She did not deny what had happened. Instead, she declared it a necessity, a union of strength that had preserved the people in their hour of greatest need. Her words rang with conviction, but Elias caught the slight tightening of her hands at her sides, the small tell of how precarious her stance truly was. She fought not only for her honor but for his life, and by extension, for humanity's chance to be seen as something other than fragile intruders. The noble's discontent did not yield easily. Voices rose, accusing her of recklessness, of weakness disguised as innovation. Some demanded his execution to cleanse the stain of heresy. Others, younger and less bound to the rigidity of the old ways, spoke cautiously in her defense, pointing to the undeniable results of their joint power. The chamber split, fault lines widening across generations and loyalties. Elias understood then that this conflict was not merely about him, it was about the very direction of the Drukhari Empire. After the council, Vera summoned him privately. Her quarters were austere, walls carved with constellations etched in silver, but the air inside felt heavier than stone. She paced as she spoke, the fire in her voice tempered by a rare admission of uncertainty. "They will not relent easily," she told him. "To them, what we did is not a victory but a fracture. They fear it more than they fear the enemy." "And you?" Elias asked, careful not to let his voice waver. She stopped, golden eyes locking onto his. For a long moment, silence hung between them, the kind that revealed more than words ever could. Then she said, softly but with steel beneath it, "I fear nothing. But I cannot fight this battle alone." The admission struck him deeper than any weapon could. She was not asking for his loyalty, she already had it. She was asking for his strength, his willingness to stand beside her in the face of not just external enemies but her own people. He realized then that their bond was not an accident of survival, but the foundation of something larger, something both fragile and indestructible. The next dawn brought another trial. Scouts returned with grim tidings. The enemy was not retreating but regrouping, amassing forces beyond anything the Drukhari had yet faced. The fortress walls, already cracked and weakened, would not endure a second assault of that scale. The nobles seized upon the report, declaring it proof that Vera's gamble had accomplished nothing but temporary reprieve. Despair rippled through the ranks, threatening to undo the fragile unity that had been forged in battle. Yet in that moment of encroaching dread, Elias felt clarity sharpen within him. The real conflict was not the enemy at their gates but the doubt within their hearts. If the Drukhari could not believe in themselves, in their princess, and in the alliance they now shared with humanity, they would fall regardless of how many weapons they bore. He remembered his own people's history, how humanity had survived not by strength alone, but by stubborn faith in the possibility of defying the impossible. When he spoke in the council chamber, his words carried none of the elegance of the nobles, but they carried weight nonetheless. He reminded them of the battle they had all witnessed, of the moment when despair had nearly consumed them, and of how victory had been forged not by clinging to tradition, but by daring to break it. "You fear change," he said, his voice steady though every eye burned against him. "But change is the only reason you're alive to fear it." The chamber fell into silence. Not acceptance, not agreement, but the first crack in the wall of resistance. Vera's gaze never left him, her expression unreadable, yet in her eyes flickered something like pride. That night, as the fortress quieted under the twin moons, Elias stood upon the balcony overlooking the scarred desert. The stars shimmered above, vast and indifferent, yet somehow closer than ever before. He felt the weight of what was coming, the storm gathering beyond the horizon. But he also felt the steady pulse of possibility, the knowledge that the choices they made now would shape not only their survival but the future of two civilizations. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of footsteps. Vera joined him, her presence a silhouette of fire and grace against the night. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence was no longer heavy. It was a shared understanding, a quiet before the storm that both dreaded and welcomed. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost tender. "The next battle will decide more than the fate of this fortress. It will decide whether we are bound by the past or freed by what we have forged together." Elias turned to her, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Then we fight." And whatever comes, we face it side by side. For the first time, her lips curved not with sarcasm or command, but with something gentler, almost human. The night wrapped around them, vast and eternal, and in that fragile moment, the bond between them no longer felt like defiance. It felt like destiny. The enemy fleet descended like a tidal wave of steel and fire, eclipsing the stars as if the cosmos itself had turned against them. From the ramparts of the battered fortress, Elias watched the horizon glow with the approach of engines, the air thickening with the tremor of their arrival. His jaw clenched as the ground beneath his boots quivered. Every instinct screamed that the walls would not hold. Yet when he turned to Vera, he found no fear etched into her face. Her golden eyes burned with the same ferocity as when she had first raised her hand against him, warning of the price of disrespect. Only now, that fire was no longer meant to keep him away, it was meant to keep the galaxy itself at bay. The Drukhari soldiers arrayed themselves with grim determination, their chants rolling like thunder through the cavernous halls. They looked not only to their princess but to the human who stood beside her, the one whose forbidden touch had unleashed a storm greater than tradition had ever allowed. Whispers no longer carried contempt but expectation. Some still struggled with what he represented, but none could deny that he had become entwined with their survival. Vera raised her hand, not in warning this time, but as a signal of unity. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade, steady and commanding. We stand at the edge of extinction or renewal. Let the stars bear witness that the Drukhari do not bend, and neither shall our allies. Her words ignited the chamber, but it was Elias who stepped forward, surprising even himself. His voice lacked her regal timbre, but it carried a rough honesty forged in hardship. Fear will break us faster than their weapons. Trust what we've built here. Trust her. Trust yourselves. The walls won't save us, but each other will. The moment did not silence every doubt, but it hardened resolve. Warriors who had once muttered against him tightened their grips on their weapons, their gazes lifting toward the enemy sky. For the first time, Elias felt not like an outsider tolerated by necessity, but a thread in the fabric of their defiance. The first strikes fell with devastating precision, plasma tearing through outer defenses in gouts of molten stone and fire. The fortress groaned under the assault, its ancient foundations shuddering as though the very desert beneath sought to give way. Elias fought shoulder to shoulder with Drukhari warriors, the clash of steel and shriek of alien energy weapons deafening. His movements were instinctive, his mind recalling battles fought on Earth, though never on this scale. Yet the rhythm of survival was universal: dodge, strike, endure. At the heart of the chaos, Vera unleashed her power in radiant bursts, constellations bending to her will as though she were a conductor commanding the heavens. But Elias saw what others missed, the cost etched into her features, the tremor of her limbs as she pushed beyond mortal limits. Each blast drained her, and though she stood unyielding, he knew she could not sustain the onslaught alone. The breach came at dusk, when enemy war machines tore through the northern wall, spewing soldiers like a flood of iron and flame. Drukhari lines buckled, their chants dissolving into screams. Elias ran toward the collapse, his lungs burning, his blade slick with blood. He reached Vera at the crumbling edge, where she stood alone, trying to seal the breach with a wall of starlight that flickered dangerously. She swayed, her body faltering under the strain. When Elias caught her arm, she did not recoil. The old taboo, the sacred boundary that had once defined their every interaction, no longer mattered. She met his gaze, breathless, and whispered, "Again." Without hesitation, he grasped her hand. The surge was immediate, a torrent of power roaring through him, scorching his veins with celestial fire. The agony was unbearable, yet it carried within it a clarity that cut through everything else. He was no longer merely human, nor was she only Drukhari. There was something beyond either, a fusion born of desperation and trust. Together, they turned the breach into a furnace of light, the enemy consumed by brilliance too fierce to endure. When the radiance dimmed, the battlefield lay still. Smoke drifted across the sands, mingling with the scent of scorched metal and blood. The fortress remained scarred but standing, its defenders battered yet unbroken. Silence spread slowly, first in disbelief, then in awe. Soldiers dropped to their knees, not before Elias, nor before Vera alone, but before the union that had remade their fate. Vera's hand lingered in his, her eyes unreadable. For a heartbeat, the weight of ceremony, tradition, and expectation pressed down upon them both. Then she released him, stepping forward to address her people. This day was not won by strength alone, nor by lineage, nor by the stars that birthed us. It was won by trust, by daring to break the chains of fate. Remember this, and know, the future does not belong to those who cling to the past. It belongs to those who seize it. The declaration rippled through the crowd, and though not all accepted it, none could deny its truth. Elias stood apart, his body aching from the fusion, but his spirit alive with a fire he had never known. He saw in the eyes of the Drukhari something new, not tolerance, not suspicion, but recognition. As night fell and the fortress quieted, Elias found himself once more at the balcony overlooking the scarred desert. Vera joined him, silent, her presence a steady flame against the cold wind. For a time, they said nothing, the silence heavy yet strangely comforting. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "The war is not over," she murmured. "But today, the galaxy has shifted. They will come again, in greater numbers, with greater fury. And yet, I no longer stand alone." Elias met her gaze, the stars reflecting in her golden eyes. "Neither do I." The desert stretched before them, vast and unyielding, but for the first time, Elias did not see it as a graveyard. He saw it as a horizon waiting to be crossed. And somewhere beyond that horizon, a galaxy trembling with the knowledge that a human and an alien princess had defied its oldest boundaries, and in doing so, had become something unstoppable.